I'm going to start this presentation with the South African legislation. So, in 2004, NEMAQA was passed. NEMAQA stands for the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act, and it superseded the 1965 APA, which was the Atmospheric Pollution Prevention Act. What's important to note about NEMAQA was that it was a foundational piece of legislation. In other words, it didn't have prescriptive limits in it. It didn't say if you were an aluminium smelter, you may emit no more than 100 milligrams per normal cubic meter of particulate matter. It didn't say that. It was a foundational piece of legislation that essentially empowered the minister to do three things. The first was to declare certain activities as listed activities. Now, a listed activity is defined as a listed activity if the whole activity, ring-fenced by the fences around the site, is on the minister's list. For example, if you are a wood processing facility such as a sawmill that manufactures compressed wood products, then that process is a listed activity. It's category 9.5 on the minister's list, and so the pollution from that activity will be legislated. The second thing that NEMAQA did was it enabled the minister to declare certain appliances as controlled emitters. So how is this different from listed activities? Well, remember that you are a listed activity if your whole process is on the minister's list. Controlled emitters are appliances, so you only have to have that specific appliance running on a part of your site, and that appliance alone is ring-fenced and the emissions from that appliance are governed if that appliance is on the controlled emitters list. And a great example is a boiler. So you might be running a sawmill that has a boiler, then the whole activity is listed because sawmills are listed under category 9.5 as I mentioned, and your boiler will be subject to the limits for boilers under controlled emitters. Now let's take a different example. You are running a baked beans factory. Food processing is not legislated. It's not one of the listed activities. So the whole factory is not a listed activity. But that factory that's manufacturing baked beans has a boiler in a boiler house. So we ring-fence the boiler house and the emissions from that boiler are legislated. So that's the difference between Section 21, listed activities, and Section 23, controlled emitters. Listed activities, your whole process, what do you do? Controlled emitters, do you have one of these specific appliances on your site? Now, the third thing that NEMAQA did is it empowered the minister to declare certain fuels as controlled fuels. That's Section 26 of NEMAQA. Now, a great example is Durban South Basin, where I believe that there was a moratorium on the combustion of coal for a while because the old airport was there, it was surrounded by hills and mountains, and so the air sat trapped in that basin. And so the minister could have the power to say no more coal combustion in that area, for example. But not a lot has been done in this regard to date. I want to take us through the hierarchy of the legislation. So what we've just looked at is the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act of 2004. NEMAQA for short. And that is a national piece of legislation, as we can see on this slide. What NEMAQA permits is for provinces to pass their own legislation, provided that the provincial legislation is stricter and not more lenient than the national legislation. NEMAQA also permits local municipalities to pass bylaws, provided that the municipal bylaw is stricter and not more lenient than the provincial legislation and the national legislation. And the final fourth tier, as we see here, is that every air quality officer who issues a license to each listed activity can impose upon that listed activity in the license limits that are stricter than the bylaw, the provincial legislation, and the national legislation, but obviously not more lenient. And so what we see is that every air quality officer has the prerogative under Section 36 of NEMAQA and 42(2)(b) to prescribe limits for a site that are actually stricter than the municipal, provincial, and national legislation. In the South African context, most air quality officers are understanding, and they usually go with the national limits. But in specific incidences and in specific areas, they might impose stricter limits if they feel that there's a risk to human health. All right, let's look at controlled emitters. There are 4 or 5 controlled emitters that have been declared to date, but arguably and by far the most important is the boiler as a controlled emitter. And the reason for this is because boilers are prolific across South Africa. I believe that the government estimated in 2010 that there were about 8,000 package boilers installed across the country. What's key to note about the declaration of a small boiler as a controlled emitter is that it only applies to boilers that are larger than 14 tons per hour. Now that number might seem like a strange number to you, but the number comes from the fact that a 14 ton per hour boiler is the equivalent of 10 megawatts of net heat input, if we look at a modern boiler. And the policymakers decided with this piece of legislation that they wanted to legislate boilers between 10 megawatts and 50 megawatts. Above 50 megawatts is actually governed under the listed activities legislation, because usually if your boilers are larger than 50 megawatts, your core process is to generate power, such as an ESCOM power station. So these boilers are governed under controlled emitters because typically if you have a boiler between 10 megawatts and 50 megawatts, it's a small ancillary piece of equipment on your site. And so it's governed under the controlled emitters legislation. What I really want you to note is that boilers that are smaller than 10 megawatts are not legislated in South Africa under the national legislation. It's possible for a province or a municipality to pass a bylaw or a piece of legislation to govern these smaller boilers, but typically that's not the case. So, boilers that are controlled emitters are greater than 14 tons per hour in size. Now, if you have one of these boilers that is larger than 14 tons per hour in size, there are 3 things that you have to do. The first is to not smoke too much. We call this opacity compliance. And the legislation is quite specific. It says you are permitted to smoke for up to 10 minutes in every 8-hour period if you have one boiler connected to one stack. And the amount of time increases if you have 2 boilers, 3 boilers, etc. connected to one common stack. The second thing you have to do, if you have a controlled emitter, a boiler that's larger than 14 tons per hour, is to do annual emissions testing, and that's the service that Yellow Tree supplies. That testing has been required since 2013, and the reports are required to be submitted to the local authorities. The third thing that you have to do if you have a small boiler that is larger than 14 tons per hour is to comply with the limits. So what are these limits? Well, the limits are rightly broken into 2 categories: boilers manufactured before November 2013 and boilers manufactured after November 2013. The date of November 2013 was chosen because that was the date on which the legislation was passed. So basically the policymakers were reasonable and they said, we're passing the legislation today, November 2013. If you already have a boiler, then there's going to be a set of emissions limits that pertain to those boilers that are more lenient, because you already have these boilers. But if you install a boiler after today, November 2013, then the limits will be stricter, because if you have the money to install a boiler after this date, then we expect you to spend additional money on installing abatement equipment appropriate to meet the limits. That was the modus operandi. So let's take a look at what those limits are. We're going to start with boilers manufactured before November 2013 because these are by far the majority of boilers in South Africa. Remember that the lifespan of a boiler is easily 40 years if the boiler is well looked after. And so we have many, many boilers in South Africa that were manufactured in the 70s, 80s, some as far back I've seen as the 1920s that are still in service today. So let's take a look at these limits. The first thing that I want you to note is that there are only limits applicable to particulate matter and to sulfur dioxide. So there's no limits for NOx, for example, which is also a pollutant from combustion. So only 2 pollutants, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide. The second thing that I want you to note is that 5 fuels are governed and that there are different limits for every fuel, which makes perfect sense. If you are running a coal-fired boiler, the emissions will be higher than if you're firing a much cleaner gas-fired boiler. So it makes sense to have different limits for the different fuels. Let's take a look at coal-fired boilers because they represent the largest portion of boilers in South Africa. What we see is a particulate matter limit of 250 milligrams per normal cubic meter at 10% oxygen. Those are the units. We see a sulfur dioxide limit of 2,800 for coal firing. Let's jump to natural gas, where we see that the limits are much lower because gas is a much cleaner fuel, as I mentioned, and we see a limit of only 20 milligrams per normal cubic meter for particulate matter and 100 milligrams per normal cubic meter for sulfur dioxide. There are 5 years of grace from when this legislation was passed until which the client has to meet these limits. And so because the legislation was passed in November 2013, every client has until November 2018, before which they have to start complying with these limits. It's important to remind you that you have to do your annual emissions testing from when the legislation was passed. So from November 2013, every year you have to use a company such as Yellowtree to come and measure your emissions from the stack, but you only have to comply with the legislated limits from November 2018 onwards. Now let's take a look at boilers that are manufactured after November 2013. What we see is that the limits are stricter, as I mentioned earlier. We see, for example, that the limit for particulate matter for coal-fired boilers installed after November 2013 is 120 milligrams per normal cubic meter, by comparison to 250 for coal-fired boilers that were manufactured before November 2013. The limit for sulfur dioxide for coal-fired boilers remains the same at 2,800 for both new boilers and old boilers. All right, so 2 things that I want you to note. The first is that if you do install a new boiler manufactured after November 2013, these limits apply immediately from the moment you install the boiler. The second thing that I want you to note is that it is the manufacture date of the boiler and not the installation date of the boiler. So if you buy a second-hand boiler that was manufactured in 1973 and you install it at your site in 2016, then it is the limits for old boilers manufactured before November 2013 that apply to that boiler, even though it was only installed on your site in 2016. Let's take a look at the timeline for controlled emitters like we did for listed activities. As I've mentioned, controlled emitters, boilers that were installed before November 2013, had no limits that applied to them up until November 2018, and from November 2018 onwards, the existing limits apply. Conversely, new boilers have the new limits apply to them immediately. Now, this is different to listed activities. Remember that with listed activities, your existing listed activity had no limits up until 2015, had the existing limits up until 2020, and then, here's the difference, from 2020 onwards, the new limits applied even to the existing listed activities. Whereas with older boilers, it's simply the existing limits that apply to those old boilers from November 2018 onwards. And the limits that apply to new boilers are never imposed on older boilers.